The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents a debate review of Is Christianity Rational? Between Matt Dillahunty and Stuart Knechtle. Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. I'm so happy that we're starting to have more and more debates. This one actually came about through a strange process, and I spoke to Stuart briefly about it. I was on another show, or maybe it was on, I think, an episode of The Hang Up. Somebody in chat asked a question like, well, do you think Stuart and Cliff Knechtle are rational? Or do you think their beliefs are rational, or something like that? That's how I took it, because the subject of rationality came up. And I was like, no, I don't. And their response was, well, I do. And I'm like, well, that's your opinion. And I don't share it, as I've actually debated them about their views before. And it was about a day or so later that Modern Day Debates contacted me and said, hey, Stuart's interested in doing a debate on whether or not Christianity is rational. So I know whoever was in the chat doing this, or I'm confident that this isn't just a coincidence. Either Stuart saw it, or somebody saw it and related, or that person related. It doesn't matter. It's all acceptable, because I don't feel like I was tricked or trapped or set up. What I think is more likely is that there are people who are just interested in these conversations and confused about it. And they also realize that my debates with Stuart have been fine. There are some debates that get more heated than others. And there's something about Stuart. Stuart's a genuinely nice guy. And we've debated before, and I've also debated his father, and I've debated him and his father at the same time, along with Josh Bowen. But there's something about our interactions where it's really hard to get too mad at him. And he did a lot of things in this particular debate that would irritate me very much coming from other people. And I just kind of let it slide off and not bug me too much. But I am going to talk about it, because this was not a good debate. It was not a good debate on Stuart's part in particular. And that's not a slight on him. It was, well, yeah, I suppose it is a little bit, but I mean, the point is that there was not a presentation of a case for rationality. Instead, there was just like a laundry list of claims, almost like a Gish Gallop. I took copious notes, particularly during his opening statement. After that, it was discussion, and so there's not much to take notes on. But I want to cut through a couple of things real quick. First of all, Modern Day Debates. That's where this debate was hosted. And yes, I'm back to doing debates at Modern Day Debates after I said I wouldn't, in part because they've made some changes so that I don't feel like every time I'm showing up, I'm just going to be, called a Nazi over and over again in chat, which isn't something that actually, bothers me, in the sense I don't mind if somebody calls me names or thinks ill of me or whatever else, but it made it feel like the environment was not taking any of this seriously, that there weren't people who were interested in the discussion, and it was just all, or seemingly, mostly trolls. But James and I have worked well, and I appreciate it. It gives, we come up with opponents, or they come up with opponents, and I say yes, and then we do debates, and then you get debates to watch, and I get debates to discuss. And this is all good, because I think there's a lot in this debate. Now, the chat is still full of trolls. I just don't pay as much attention to them. It was funny. Every now and then I'd glance over, because I'm not actually logged in and chatting, but I can see it if I look over at another monitor. And somebody, is like, Matt's wrong and he knows it. Matt's wrong and he knows it. And I'm just sitting here going, that's just a flat assertion that I can easily dismiss, because I don't think I'm wrong, and I definitely don't know that I'm wrong. And what's funny is that it's sort of an accusation that I'm lying, that I know that I don't have a leg to stand on. Also, somebody in chat kept saying, well, Matt still hasn't told us what he means by rational, which was bizarre, because I was the only one who did. Stuart's opening was all about why he finds Christianity rational, but he didn't take a moment to even discuss what rational means. and seemed a little surprised that I drew a distinction between whether or not something is rational and whether or not it's true. Um, Truth is something that's verified. Um, these are the facts which are about reality, which are verified and to some extent understood, or at least described well enough that we can say, yes, we have this, and we have some, reason to think that this is in fact the case. But what's rational? I started my opening by pointing out that there's two different usages of this that debaters run into. One of which is the notion of internally consistent, and so like the rules for Super Mario or Dungeons and Dragons or whatever are internally consistent. So the actions that take place in there are rational. It would be irrational to think that, Mario could jump up, go backwards 23 screens, and then teleport to the end of the level. Now, of course, things like that can possibly happen in bugs in code, but we're talking about the system itself. And I pointed out how that version of rational doesn't get us anywhere, because you could have any fantasy thing that is rational. What matters about rationality is its external consistency. It's consistency with the facts of the universe. And I'm going to be doing videos later, including one about the difference between evidence for a proposition or evidence for an hypothesis and facts that are merely consistent with a proposition. But we'll get to that another time. So I was the only one that actually bothered to find what I meant by rational, and yet I get called out in chat as, oh, Matt doesn't say what's rational. And they say that in part because there are a lot of people who are really irritated when I say I don't know what evidence would convince me. Because first of all, you have to make a claim. It has to be a testable, falsifiable claim. And then we have to evaluate what sort of facts you could present, which would be not just consistent with the evidence of reality, but evidence for a particular proposition. And I find it a little arrogant to say, oh, yes, I know exactly what evidence should convince me of the difference between an all-powerful being and some sort of trickery. Like, it suggests that you can't be tricked. And so the point isn't to say what evidence would convince you. The point is always to say, what evidence have you got? You won't walk into a courtroom and, have the prosecution and the defense say, the prosecution stands up and says, we're convinced that Matt Dillahunty over here is a murderer, and we would like to present evidence to that claim. And so first, let me ask the defense, or let me ask the jury, what evidence would convince you? Well, that's just silly. The jury doesn't necessarily have to know, nor is it wise for them to know and say, oh, yes, we would want evidence of this and this and this. Now, generally speaking, we know what sort of evidence shouldn't be convincing. If we're relying solely on testimonial, anecdotal evidence, evidence that is more correlated than causated, or that demonstrates correlation but doesn't demonstrate causation. We're talking about causality. You want something that's necessary and sufficient, something that's temporally proximal as well. But you don't walk into the jury and say, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, please tell us what evidence you'd like to have, and we'll see what we can get. No, you show up and you present your case, and then you try to argue for why it is or is not, or should or shouldn't be compelling. And it's frustrating for me that people keep getting this wrong, but it's also frustrating for them that they're not getting what they look for. So in Stuart's opening, he says you have to start with the founder. And I have a lot of notes, but they're shorthand, and some of them I'm not going to get specific, but he said something like, if there is a God, it would make a lot of sense for him to relationally connect to us. And I agree, except that I don't see any evidence of any relational connection. His next one was the next one that I jotted down was Jesus claimed to be God. Okay, but that's a claim. That's not evidence for a claim. Jesus received worship. Okay, but that doesn't mean that that Christianity is true. There's plenty of other beings that have been worshipped. Or Jesus forgave sins. We had a little back and forth during the debate about this, where when I pointed it out, he says like, oh, I don't think I said Jesus forgave sins. You absolutely did. But in any case, he just claimed that he forgave sins. Demonstrate that any sins were actually forgiven, or that sin is a real concept and that forgiveness of a sin is a real concept. There's the various I am statements that are attributed to Jesus, but those are all the claim. And then he never did anything angry in the Gospels, which we got into a little bit later when, I talked about the fact that he made a scourge and chased the moneylenders out of the temple. That's in the story and seems to be completely overlooked when you're talking about his character. There's a whole bunch of statements and things that he referenced where it's just Jesus is a cool guy and a good guy. He's tender without weakness, except in the Garden of Gethsemane, where near the end there's some apparent weakness, not just tenderness. But then he says that the claims and the character are only halfway there. Well, they're not even halfway there. All you have are claims. Claims aren't evidence. You need evidence to show that those claims are real and true and justified. And then you can make the case that it is then rational to believe the proposition that Jesus was God or Jesus was divine. But then he gets to reliability of the Gospels, and they're dated close to the events, except that there's no way to demonstrate the reliability of the Gospels because there is no external evidence, no contemporary first century accounts that corroborate the significant events that are in there. Nothing about a census that would require people to leave their homes and travel to where they were born, the various genealogies, which also don't line up, the purported miracle events. All of these things are there as claims, not as evidence. And so the first half of his opening is, here's a bunch of stuff the Bible claims, and I think that makes it rational. And then here's a whole bunch more stuff the Bible claims, and I think that makes it rational. And then he gets into the million words related to Jesus by the early church fathers. But these are people a century or centuries later reporting what they believe. And so it gets to be a case for a bunch of other people believed it. And that makes it rational. Then he gets to the resurrection, where everything hinges on that. We all bring our biases to it. How do we interpret the data? That's cool, but there isn't data. What data are you talking about, Stuart? You have accounts of a resurrection and no data, no evidence, nothing at all substantive to point to. And for this, he wants to go with the cumulative case, where he talks about the witnesses, the skeptics that converted, the expectations of the gospel message, the Jewish background, the martyrs, the immediate proclamation, the empty tomb, the use of women as eyewitnesses, and a paradigm shift. Except every single one of these is about, were people convinced, not was it rational for people to be convinced? This is the core of mine and Stuart's strong disagreement on this. You have the gospel messages, you have the events that happened afterwards, but those events testify to whether or not people were convinced of the claims, not whether or not they should have been convinced of the claims. And this quick spreading of the message puts you in a position where, as he mentioned, you got to figure out whether it's a hoax or truth, and there were other failed messiahs. You haven't demonstrated that Jesus wasn't a failed messiah. You haven't even demonstrated that he was a messianic at all. And he's like, why did this one Jesus work? Why did this one Messiah work? Well, you don't get to conclude, it's not rational to conclude that because one of them gained popularity, which, by the way, propagates itself. Once you have people who believe, they share it with other people, and in order to be included in the in-group, those people are likely to believe as well. And when they're raised by their parents who believe, they're likely to believe as well. It's once there's the momentum that carries on, that's how it continues to spread. And then it spreads by conquest, by declaration, by taking over as, the official religions of states. I mean, we live in the United States where we actually are supposed to have freedom of religion, but that's a fairly new thing. Prior to that, there was the official state religion. We are the people who believe this. And as soon as you convince a couple of leaders and along those lines, That's why it takes off. Now, all of the things that he presented get to, there's a bunch of Bible stories and a bunch of people who believed him. Not one piece of evidence, not one strong data point that is independent of that shows that the claims are likely consistent with the truth of reality, which is how we were defining, or at least how I was defining, whether or not something's rational. It's possible for something to be rational, or it is possible for it to be rational to accept something, whether it's true or not. The prime example that I tend to use is whether you live in a heliocentric or a geocentric solar system. Is the Earth the center of the solar system, or is the sun? And once upon a time, all of the available evidence that you had and the understanding meant that it was rational to believe that the sun orbited the Earth. You could literally you look up and you see that. Oh, the sun's going across the sky. That's rational. And that doesn't mean that it's true. It just means it's consistent with the available facts. Once we learned more facts, that changed our understanding of cosmology. But all Stuart presented is people who found it convincing. Now, it's unfortunate, but that is not a case for rationality. That is a massive argumentum ad populum. And there are other fallacies in this as well. But when we had our back and forth, after we got past the near Gish Gallop of claims, none of which were backed up, none of which were supported by evidence, none of which would make it rational to believe, the rest of it became really confusing, because I asked about what evidence could God not provide. This, I think, is a particularly profound question, which occurred to me just in this form, just a day before the debate while I was talking to someone else. What evidence can God not provide? And then the follow-up becomes, which we didn't even really get to, why is it that God can't provide that kind of evidence? Now, certainly we wouldn't expect a God to be able to present evidence that is logically impossible. We're not talking about a God that can violate logic, I hope. But figuring out what evidence, because like, what evidence would you like? What evidence would you like? What evidence can God not provide is my question. I'd also like to know what evidence God can provide, but that's a rather straightforward question. It's like, what evidence can you provide? I can provide you with any evidence that exists if I were God. But so maybe the answer to what evidence can God not provide is evidence that doesn't exist or evidence that isn't true. Cool. Then if it's true that he's God, then he should be able to present evidence for it. And if you can't have evidence for it, then you can't have a rational belief that someone is God, whether they claim it or not, whether they can do impressive things or not. We didn't really get to that. Instead, what we kept getting was, Matt thinks this, or Matt probably thinks this, or Matt would probably say this, or Matt would want this. And on almost every occasion, Stuart was completely wrong. This was the biggest problem for me in the debate. And I've tried to think of the best way to phrase this to people, and in particular to Stuart as well. So, Stuart, if you're watching, no ill will, but stop doing that. It's embarrassingly bad. The purpose of being there to debate is to present the case for why Christianity is rational. The more you try to make it about me, the more obvious it is that you don't have a single thing to present for your case. Because, despite what you seem to think, while I would like justice, I do not agree with you on what you seem to think justice and judgment day would be. I do not agree that the evangelical Christian notion of judgment day is in fact justice. I don't find the Christian paradigm just at all. I don't think that there is a path for justice when the person who slaughters a family of 4 can go to heaven and have to and end up being right beside two of the members of the family of four that he slaughtered, and the other two members of the family of four are burning in hell. I don't see anything that's just in that. But when you were like, oh, Matt and I would want justice. Yes, I want justice, but my understanding and my view of justice is very different from yours. Well, Matt would probably tell somebody who was in their deathbed dying of cancer that their life is meaningless. No. First of all, what we would say is independent of what's actually true. I don't think people's lives are meaningless at all. I think that there's no reason to suspect that there's an externally imposed meaning or purpose to life, or an externally imposed value to our life. I think that we give our lives value. And that person who on their deathbed, I don't see any reason to discuss the meaning or purpose or value of their life at all. My conversations with someone on their deathbed would be about, are you comfortable? What do you need? How can I help? I love you. I value you. Oh, well, what do you think's going to last of us? Well, I'm going to carry some very fond memories of you, and so will others. And that's got to be enough for me right now. And if somebody said, well, do you think I'm going to heaven? I don't think there's a heaven to go to, but it doesn't matter what I think. It matters what is. And if you think you have a good reason for it, or if this is something that brings you comfort. But these are deep conversations. I've been by people who were not quite at death's door, but very close, or close enough to where conversations like this come up. At no point would I walk in and say, your life is meaningless. There's no purpose. Ha ha ha. I mean, it's this cartoon version of me that Stuart has in his head would be annoying if it weren't presented as an absolute straw man throughout the debate. Well, Matt thinks this. Matt probably thinks this. I'm literally sitting right there. We have set up a structure where you and I get to interact, where you get to ask what I think. So stop propping up a straw man and just ask me what I think. I'm not shy about answering. I'm not shy about telling people what I think. But when you do that, and I'm just sitting there shaking my head, everybody knows that you are presenting a straw man, because you do not want the actual answer from the actual person that is actually sitting right there with you to have this conversation. It's also, by the way, for the purposes of this debate, completely irrelevant. I may not be rational. I may not have a good understanding of what rationality is. I could be completely insane, hopelessly divorced from reality. I could be wrong about virtually everything I'm saying, and all of that is irrelevant to whether or not Christianity is rational. And it's also irrelevant as to whether or not you've presented any reason for anyone to think Christianity is rational. Unless your syllogism is, Matt Dillahunty is irrational, Matt Dillahunty does not believe Christianity is rational, therefore Christianity is rational, my state of mind is irrelevant. But that syllogism is fallacious, and I'll leave it up to the audience and you to go learn something about fallacies and syllogisms to discover why. The topic was, is Christianity rational? No one needs to ask me any questions at all about what I think, because that's not how you make a case. Your job, Stuart, is to walk in and present the evidence and argument for why Christianity is rational. And you didn't do it. You went through a quick, half-assed parade of claims that all tied to, here's what the Bible said, and here's how a bunch of people believed it. And the fact that they believed it it convinces me that it's rational. But not just that, he says, not just that. It's about putting it into practice in my life and seeing the results. So we can go with the argumentum ad populum, the appeal to popularity of it. And then we can go with his personal experience. I've tried out being a Christian, and it seems to benefit my life. Well, maybe acting like a Christian produces positive effects in somebody's life, independent of whether or not Christianity is true, and independent of whether or not you can demonstrate Christianity is rational. Because as I pointed out in my opening, it's possible for something to be true and for it not to be rational to accept that it's true. And so perhaps Christianity might be true. There might be a God that's doing wonderful works in your life, and yet no one has a rational reason to believe that it's true. Not even you, not even the person impacted by that. That scenario is logically possible. This is one of the biggest failings of apologists when we start talking about what's rational. I have a friend, hi Eddie, who would not debate whether or not Christianity is rational because there was concern, at least in one conversation, about them presenting this internal consistency. And as I pointed out in the debate, I'm not even convinced that Christianity is necessarily internally consistent. But when it comes to consistency with the facts of reality, the only thing that's consistent with the facts of reality are that people made claims and people believed claims. That's it. Jesus claimed to be God. Okay. I don't even know that that's true. I'm not a mythicist, but you haven't demonstrated that it necessarily existed. But even if we assume that he existed, you haven't demonstrated that any of the claims that were made about what he said are true and accurate. All we have are in the Gospels are anonymous reports that probably aren't from eyewitnesses, but even if they were from eyewitnesses, still wouldn't demonstrate that Jesus said the things that he's supposed to have said in the message. And yet apologists want to say, the book says it, therefore it's good. Therefore it's rational to believe. And a whole bunch of other people have believed it, therefore I'm in good keeping. No, you're not. No, you're not. The fact of the matter is, all of those I am statements that Stuart wanted to just throw in there without listing, the seven I ams, did he list them? It's not even wise to say them, to point to them at all, because you can't demonstrate that they were ever said. You can't demonstrate that they're accurate quotes, and you can't demonstrate the truth of those quotes. When he talked about a massive paradigm shift, about how Christianity spread to the world, and that it's most rational to believe that that's the case if it was true, I used something that Arden had said to me, which is there's a prominent recent example, and that is QAnon and the supposed theft of the 2020 election. That spread incredibly quickly and led to an insurrection in a very short period of time, an attack on the government. We're talking about probably more people accepting and believing it than anybody accepting Christianity in the entire first century, or a good chunk of the first century. And this happened in a couple of years, a couple of months. What it takes for some idea to take over and become popular is for people to sincerely believe it, for people to spread it to others to try to convince them, for there to be some sort of incentive of being part of the group or inside the group or feeling ostracized or any of those things, to motivate people to hold on to false beliefs in the face of evidence to the contrary, which is the case with the election, or for it to be untestable and unfalsifiable, so that people can pretend they are being rational when they're not. Christianity, by virtue of it not being consistent with testable, verifiable facts of reality, is not rational. And Stuart didn't even make an attempt to define rational or to show why it's rational. Instead, Stuart's entire case was, here's why I believe. I believe because I find the Bible convincing. Other people found the Bible convincing. And when I put it to work in my life, I feel like it works. That's Stuart's case. None of it has to do with whether or not Christianity is rational. None of it is a demonstration of anything even in the ballpark of that. And that's why I found it a pleasant debate, but ultimately very disappointing. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.